Before we begin, there's a link in the description to join the email list. Subscribers receive carefully researched ebooks, detailed videos showing real woodworking projects built step by step, and timber-focused material that isn't published publicly. It's quiet, detailed work for people who want to understand wood beyond surface techniques. Now let's begin. The most expensive mistakes in timber rarely come from bad tools, but from ignoring grain. Modern construction treats wood as a standardized product. Boards are measured, graded, cut, and installed according to dimensions, not direction. The grain is visible, but it is rarely allowed to influence decisions beyond appearance. This works well enough in the short term that the deeper consequences remain easy to ignore. Old carpenters, they worked under a completely different assumption. For them, grain direction wasn't just a suggestion or a preference, it was, a governing rule. If you broke that rule, it might not lead to immediate failure, but over time, you could count on the mistake being revealed. Wood would split where it was restrained, warp where it was forced, and weaken where its fibers were asked to work against themselves. The law was actually pretty simple. Never ask wood to resist forces across the grain that it is meant to carry along it. Wood is strong because its fibers are aligned, not because it's solid. The real strength of timber comes from those long, continuous fibers running parallel to the tree's growth. Along the grain, wood carries enormous load with relatively little material. Across the grain, its strength drops dramatically. Old carpenters internalized this reality through daily work. Beams were oriented so loads traveled along fibers, not across them. Joints were cut to bear in compression along the grain rather than rely on cross-grain tension. Modern construction often ignores this difference. Loads are transferred through metal connectors that do not care about grain direction, and wood is expected to comply. It does, temporarily. Over time, the fibers respond in predictable ways. Across the grain stress is where wood begins to fail quietly. When wood is loaded across the grain, it does not usually snap or collapse. It compresses, creeps, and gradually loses its ability to recover. Fibers crush and separate microscopically long before visible damage appears. Old builders avoided placing structural loads across the grain because they understood this slow failure. They housed beams into posts so the load was carried vertically along the post's fibers. These days, modern details often rely on brackets, ledgers, and bolts that actually impose sustained cross-grain stress. Over time, the wood yields slowly, joints loosen, and, movement appears. This movement is often blamed on shrinkage or poor fastening, but honestly, the real cause is often grain misuse. End grain is often discussed today in terms of moisture absorption, but its structural role was equally important to old carpenters, Loads delivered into end grain travel along fibers, which is really where wood performs best. Traditionally, posts carried beams directly on their tops. Sills supported studs vertically. Even in complex joinery, old builders, always looked for ways to deliver weight into the end grain rather than pulling the fibers apart sideways. These days, modern framing frequently reverses this logic. Beams are hung from metal hangers rather than bearing on posts. Vertical loads are transferred through fasteners instead of relying on fiber continuity. The structure does stand, but honestly, the wood is being asked to behave like a material it just isn't. Grain direction governed how boards were oriented, not just how they looked. Flat-sawn and quarter-sawn timber were, used differently depending on exposure and load. Boards were oriented so seasonal movement would work with the structure rather than against it. For exterior cladding, grain orientation influenced how boards cupped and shed water, and for flooring, it really influenced wear and stability. Modern milling and installation practices often, prioritize speed and uniformity. Boards are installed based on size and convenience, with grain orientation treated as kind of just cosmetic. The consequences, they appear later as distortion, joint stress, and uneven movement. Old joinery was designed to respect fiber continuity. Mortise and tenon joints, lap joints, and scarf joints were not arbitrary traditions. They were solutions that respected grain direction while solving structural problems. Material was removed in ways that preserved long fibers wherever possible. Old carpenters avoided cutting across grain in critical zones. When they had to, they compensated with geometry that redirected forces back into the grain. These days, modern joinery often substitutes metal for geometry. The wood, it becomes more of a passive element held together by hardware rather than playing an active role as a structural participant. Grain direction also governs how wood moves over time. Wood moves far more across the grain than it does along it. Old builders, they really accounted for this in every large assembly. Panels were allowed to float, frames were designed to permit expansion, and, boards could slide just a bit in their fixings. Ignoring grain direction in this context leads to restrained movement. When boards cannot expand or contract as intended, stress accumulates. Cracks appear, joints open, and surfaces distort. Historic failures taught lessons that modern builders rarely see. Old carpenters learned from failure because structures were repaired, not replaced. When a beam crushed at a joint or a post split along a fastener line, the cause was studied and corrected in the next build. Understanding grain direction is understanding wood's limits. Grain direction is not a rule invented by tradition. It is an observation drawn from the anatomy of trees and the physics of fibers. Breaking it does not cause immediate collapse, but it guarantees inefficiency, movement, and long-term weakness. Old carpenters did not romanticize this knowledge. They relied on it because, their structures had to endure without constant intervention. Wood remains one of the most capable structural materials available, but only when it is allowed to work in the direction it was grown to work. The grain direction law old carpenters followed was not conservative or outdated. It was precise, practical, and grounded in long observation. Understanding this law really changes how you design, build, and evaluate timber structures. It shifts attention from surface treatments and hardware back to the material itself, where the real answers have always been. If you want more in-depth material like this, including long-form explanations and real project observations that aren't shared publicly, you can join the email list using the link in the description. That's where the deeper work continues. Thanks for spending this time with Old World Timber.